the 2010 Atlanta Press Club debates, brought to you live from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Now, the Republican race for Secretary of State.
Good evening. I'm John Sherrick, reporter for WXIA-TV in Atlanta. We'd like to welcome viewers at home as well as our live studio audience to the 2010 primary election campaign debates originating from the studios of GPB. Tonight's debate is organized by the Atlanta Press Club. Now let's meet the Republican candidates facing each other in Georgia's Secretary of State primary election. They are, in alphabetical order, Brian Kemp. He is the current Secretary of State and a small business owner. And Doug MacGinnitie is a co-founder of the commercial insurance brokerage firm. Now here's the format for tonight's debate. In the first round, each candidate will answer a question from one of our three panelists. In the second round, the candidates will ask a question of each other. Each candidate will have time for rebuttal in this second round. And in the third round, the panelists will continue at questioning the candidates. And finally, each candidate will have 30 seconds to make a closing statement. Now, before we get started, let's meet our three panelists selected by the Atlanta Press Club. First, we have Ray Matoyer, anchor for WNEG-TV in Athens. And we have Melissa Stiers, who is a reporter-producer for Georgia Public Broadcasting. And our final panelist is Dave Williams, the government reporter for the Atlanta Business Chronicle. Now let's get started with the debate. In the first round, each candidate will be asked a question by one of our panelists. The candidates have 30 seconds to answer each question, and as moderator, I'll determine if a rebuttal is necessary. By random selection, Brian Kemp gets the first question from Ray Matoyer.
Mr. Kemp, last week your office announced the filing of the federal lawsuit for approval of Georgia's voter registration process, yet the Department of Justice has rejected this plan twice, saying it unfairly discriminates against minority voters. When they used the 2000 election as an example, they said that more than 3,000 citizens were flagged and had to take an inconvenient step in order for their votes to count. Yet you're pushing for these checks in a lawsuit. What would you say to critics who say that you're doing this as more of an effort to push the conservative agenda, even though it's a waste of the taxpayers' time and money?
Well, I think I'd say to people that we're trying to protect their vote. We're the only state in the country that's out of compliance with a federal piece of legislation called the Help America Vote Act. The Department of Justice actually came to the previous administration because the previous administration of that, the Cox administration, had not implemented what they were supposed to be doing. And that's why we're doing this process. It was a federal law that passed. We're mandated to do that. And unfortunately, we got a federal agency that won't let us do it. So that's why we're suing.
Melissa Stiers, you may ask the final question in this round for Doug MacGinnitie.
Mr. MacGinnitie, do you intend to push the current voter verification checks with this lawsuit if you are Secretary of State?
Absolutely. I think, again, we have two laws here in Georgia. One, the voter ID law, and the other is the citizenship law. I think both of them pass the common sense test. They help keep integrity in our elections. And absolutely, if I'm fortunate enough to be elected Secretary of State, I think we need to continue the process in court, to continue to make sure that our elections have integrity here in Georgia. And I think both of those laws pass the common sense test that is so important to our citizens here in Georgia.
That concludes round one. It's now time for candidates to ask each other a question. You have 15 seconds for the question and 30 seconds to respond and 15 seconds for a rebuttal. By random selection, Doug MacGinnitie asked the first question of Brian Kemp.
In the late 1990s, when we were working to build a Republican majority here in the state, when we were trying to elect folks like Senator Johnny Isakson, the late Senator Paul Coverdale, and Guy Milner, there were many highly contested races, and yet not once, not twice, but 3 consecutive times, Mr. Kemp, you chose to vote in Democrat primaries. Can you explain why you voted in those Democrat primaries when you claim that you've been working to elect Republicans your entire career?
Well, I can. You know, when you live in a place like Athens, Clark County, where Michael Dukakis won the presidential election, we didn't have a whole lot of Republican primaries. Matter of fact, we didn't have any. And if you wanted to be involved in local government and making those decisions when it's affecting your taxes, you voted in some Democratic races, just like a lot of conservatives in South Georgia do. But unlike yourself, I have never voted in a Democratic presidential preference primary like you did, I believe, in 1992.
Do you have a rebuttal?
I do. I think actually Rush Limbaugh stole my idea. In 1992, we did not have a contested primary, so I got to vote against the Democrat that I thought would be the least effective. But I do think it's important to note that while we were working to build that majority in the late 80s and the late 90s, you chose not to vote in those primaries, and I think the citizens ought to know that.
Thank you. Now, Brian Kemp, you may ask a question of Doug MacGinnitie.
Well, Mr. MacGinnitie, your recent mailings have had some falsehoods in them, and matter of fact, some flat-out lies. You didn't understand state elections law, and the AJC's called you out on some of the things that you were talking to me about in your mailers, and now we're hearing about a company that you say that you founded when actually you look at the website and you were in high school at the time. I was just wondering if you might could clear that up for us.
Absolutely. I think this is the kind of political attack that I've come to expect in this campaign. But I think you need to get your facts right before you do that. We did find a company several years ago, and as part of that, we've built a fantastic company here that's headquartered in Georgia that has over 500 jobs, many of which are located here in the Atlanta area. So, again, if you're going to attack me, at least I'd hope you get your facts straight before you do that.
Mr. Kemp?
Well, I think talking about attacks, I believe you're the first one in this race that started sending photographers over to my campaign events, sending out anonymous robocalls, putting flyers on my supporters' cars that you weren't even man enough to put your name on. So I believe you're the one that started this.
Thank you. That concludes our second round of questioning. Now, for those who may be joining us right now, this is the debate among the candidates for Georgia's Secretary of State in the Republican primary. For our third round, we return to our panelists, our panel of journalists who will ask questions of the candidates of his or her choice. Candidates will be allowed 30 seconds to respond, and as moderator, I'll determine if an opposing candidate will need to rebut, and there will be 15 seconds for that rebuttal. We'll begin this round with a question from Dave Williams.
This will be for Mr. Kemp. Candidates in several high-profile races this year are trying to get on the ballot as independents, the governor's race being one, the school superintendent's race, and also locally Fulton County Commission chairman. It's a very difficult thing to do under Georgia law. Lots of studies have said Georgia is one of the most difficult states for independents to get on the ballot. Would you support legislation making it easier for independents to qualify?
Well, what my thinking is, I believe we need total elections reform in Georgia. If you'll look at my Safe Elections Plan, Secure, Accessible, Fair Elections, it details what I want to continue to do as Secretary of State. And one of the things is to appoint a nonpartisan panel with all the members of different parties and independents and third parties, and basically go around the state and have town hall meetings and get a lot of input about third parties, about anything elections reform related, and really have those vetted through a committee that hopefully would get bipartisan support on for the legislature, and then look at all those things at that time.
Now Ray Matoyer will ask a question.
Actually, I'd like to throw this out for both of you. This involves the whole election process and how confusing it can be. In Northeast Georgia, we just had the Congressional 9 race, the runoff. So you had people running to replace Nathan Deal. Then there was the election, and then there was the runoff, and now Mr. Graves won, and now it continues again. A lot of people are just confused about the whole process. They thought that they had voted for this all again. What can the Secretary of State's office, and you can start with it, what can the Secretary of State's office do to ensure more clarity in confusing elections like that one?
Well, I think education is probably the simplest answer to that. In that kind of situation, there's not much that can be done. Because of the resignations of the folks involved, there were going to be 2 elections. And because of the number of folks involved, there were going to be runoffs to those elections. But I think educating and making sure that the electorate is aware of what's going on is absolutely the key. But there's a limit to what can be done other than that.
Mr. Kemp?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we want to look at in our elections reform when we get through this election. One of the problems with not having both of those elections, the special and the primary, on the same day is there would have actually been runoffs on different days. So even as confusing as it is the way it played out, it would have been even more confusing to have both of those elections on July the 20th and then have a runoff for the primary 3 weeks later and the special election 4 weeks later. That's something we are going to fix in the law next year, and those are the kind of things that we need to work with our local elections folks and others to see that are out there now that need fixing, and that's just what we're going to do.
Thank you. Now, Melissa Stiers, it's your turn to ask a question now.
If both candidates could answer this question, how will you address concerns about the electronic voting machines and the lack of a paper trail to verify votes?
Mr. Kemp, why don't you begin?
That's a great question. That comes up often. I tell people that don't trust the electronic machines to vote an absentee ballot, so they have a paper ballot to vote. I think the majority of Georgians feel that the machines that we have now are secure. I certainly do. There's a lot of checks and balances there. But I have stated in my elections plan that as we go forward, I'm certainly open to looking at having a paper trail if that's the way we want to go. There's going to be federal legislation in a few years that's going to dictate a lot of what we have to do. And I don't think right now we can afford to spend $30 to $50 million to change the machines today. But that doesn't mean that I'm not willing to look forward to a paper trail in the future.
Mr. MacGinnitie.
7 years ago, the state spent over $50 million to buy the 20,000 voting machines that we use here in the state. I don't know about y'all, but in my house, anything that's 7 years old and electronic doesn't work very well anymore. And I think we need to start looking towards the next generation. We need to be very inclusive, include local election officials, state election officials, and folks who have been really involved in the technology world to look at how we can upgrade those systems. We absolutely need to have a way to audit the election process in this state to make sure that the folks in the state feel like there's integrity to the process.
Thank you. Now, Dave Williams, your turn to ask a question again.
Thank you. This will be for Mr. MacGinnitie. You frequently portrayed Mr. Kemp in the campaign as a career politician, and the inference is that that's a negative thing, and he does not deserve support for that reason. First of all, why should it be a negative thing to be perceived as a career politician? And secondly, having been 2 terms in the legislature, in the state Senate, why does that necessitate putting him in that category?
Well, I think anybody who stood in front of the folks of the state of Georgia 4 years ago and held themselves out to be the best person to run for and be agriculture commissioner, and then 4 years later holds himself out to be the best person to be Secretary of State, and has run for or contemplated running for 5 offices in the last 6 years, is clearly wants to make a career in politics. I think it's more important that we have folks from the business world who have actually created jobs and done stuff in the private sector involved in our government, and that's why I chose to run, and that's what I think I can bring to the office.
Mr. Kemp.
Well, I think you have somebody from the business world right now in the Secretary of State's office. I'm fortunate to have founded and developed many small businesses, which we still have today. I'm proud of my service in the Georgia State Senate. I was one of those tough races we won to get us the majority back when Governor Perdue went in. And I think it's good to have experience. It's good to have somebody that knows their way around the Capitol.
Ray Matoyer, your turn to ask a question.
Again, for both of you, one of the issues that we're having in the state with tax collections is that there are a lot of businesses that are not paying their taxes. Yet the Secretary of State's office is one of the only entities in government that really knows where most of the businesses are and who is doing business. What role can the Secretary of State's office play in helping with tax collections?
Well, I think certainly from a data standpoint, I mean, one of the things that we've done, we redesigned our corporation's website this year to make it easier for Georgians to go online and renew and start a corporation. But in doing that, we've collected a lot of email addresses. We're able to communicate with corporations a lot quicker now. We have better, I think, easier access for data that we can share with the Department of Revenue. And we're certainly open to working on to resolve these issues, because there are folks in Georgia, believe it or not, that are not paying their taxes, and they need to be. And we'll assist other agencies any way that we can.
Thank you. Mr. MacGinnitie.
I think that the key is working with the local collection officials, much like we did in Sandy Springs. We worked with a collection agency, worked with the data we could get from the state to identify those companies that were doing business but were not paying taxes. And I think the Secretary of State needs to be working with all those local jurisdictions, be it the county, the cities, who are trying to enforce the laws and trying to collect that data. There's no reason the Secretary of State can't do that and shouldn't do that.
Thank you both. Now, we have no more time for questions. Each of the Republican candidates in the primary for the Secretary of State will now have 30 seconds for a closing statement. Doug MacGinnitie was randomly selected to make the first statement.
First, to the folks at GPTV and the panelists, thank you all very much for having us here this evening in the Atlanta Press Club. The Secretary of State's office is a $25 million, 350-employee executive office of the state of Georgia. And I think if you take a look at my business background, you'll feel comfortable giving me and entrusting me with that responsibility, and knowing that if I can do it for less, you will get your money back. I think you have a pretty clear choice in this race. If you want the guy with the longest list of endorsements from the politicians and lobbyists at the Capitol, I'm not your man. But if you want to vote for somebody and you elect somebody who's lived in the private sector and can bring some new blood and some new leadership and some new ideas to state government, I would love to earn your vote and support. Thank you.
Brian Kemp will now give his closing statement.
My name is Brian Kemp. Since becoming Secretary of State, I've done exactly what I said I was going to do. I've cut spending by $2.9 million, including reducing my own pay. I'm suing the Obama Justice Department to make sure that we check someone's citizenship before they register to vote. I've launched new initiatives to help stop voter fraud, and I've helped our military overseas voters have an easier time to vote. With your support and your help on July 20th, I'll continue those efforts, and you guarantee that I'll get it done. Thanks for your support.
And that concludes our debate. We'd like to remind voters that the primary elections will be held on Tuesday, July 20th. Our thanks to the candidates and to our panel of journalists. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging today's debate. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club, you may visit the Atlanta Press Club website at atlantapressclub.org. The debates that air on Georgia Public Broadcasting will be archived on the Press Club's website. I'm John Schierick. Thanks for joining us for the primary election debate. We invite you to stay tuned for the primary election debate among the candidates in the Democratic primary for Secretary of State. That debate is coming up next.
Club Debate Series is made possible by a donation from the late Tom Watson Brown.